Caleb Thorne believed in fences. Not just the split rail and barbed wire that divided his land from the endless Montana wilderness, but the ones he had built around his heart. They were taller, stronger, and far more effective. They kept the world out, and more importantly, they kept the past locked in. The war had taught him that connection was a liability, a vulnerability waiting to be exploited by cannon fire or dysentery. Solitude was survival. He rode the perimeter of his property, the cold air a familiar bite against the exposed skin of his face. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a heavy, swollen purple that promised a blizzard. His horse, Ajax, a sturdy roan with a spirit as quiet as Caleb's own, snorted, its breath a plume of white smoke in the frigid air. He pulled his collar higher, the ruff wool scratching his jaw. The silence was his sanctuary, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the mournful sigh of the wind through the pines. It was a good life, a hard one but honest. He answered to no one but the seasons and his own rigid code. He expected nothing and offered the same in return. That was the contract he'd made with this harsh, beautiful land, and for 5 years it had been honored. He was checking the northern fence line, the one that bordered the old, disused wagon trail, when he saw it. A dark shape, half swallowed by the first thick flakes of snow that had begun to fall like a curtain being drawn across the world. It was a wagon, or what was left of one. A broken wheel jutted out at a pitiable angle, the canvas cover torn and flapping like a wounded bird's wing. It was a fool's errand to be on this trail at all, but to be on it with a storm like this closing in was a death sentence. His first instinct, sharp and cold as the wind, was to turn Ajax around and ride away. It was not his business. Involvement was a poison he had purged from his system long ago. He had his cabin, his stores, his solitude. That was all he needed to weather the storm, both the one in the sky and the one that still raged inside him. But his father's voice, a ghost from a life before the war, echoed in his mind. A man who turns his back on folks in need is no man at all. Caleb cursed under his breath, the sound stolen by the rising gale. His code, the one that demanded self-reliance above all, had a single, troublesome clause. You did not leave people to die. Not if you could help it. He fought the urge, the physical pull to retreat to the safety of his isolation. It was a battle, his gut tightening with a familiar dread. But honor, that last stubborn remnant of the man he used to be, won. It always did. He urged Ajax forward, the horse picking its way carefully through the deepening snow. As he drew closer, he saw movement near the ruined wagon. A figure, small and huddled, was trying to shield two even smaller shapes from the wind. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the white powder. The wind howled, a physical force that tried to push him back. "Hello, the wagon," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The figure startled, turning a face toward him that was pale with cold and fear. It was a woman. Her bonnet was gone, her dark hair whipped across her face by the wind. She clutched 2 small children, their faces buried in the folds of her worn wool coat. Her eyes, a startling shade of blue against her ashen skin, were wide with a mixture of terror and desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice so thin it was almost lost in the storm. "My children were so cold." Caleb's gaze fell on the children. A boy, maybe 5 or 6, and a girl, younger still. Their tiny bodies were shaking uncontrollably. He looked at the woman again. She was shivering too, but her arms were a fortress around her young. He saw the grim set of her jaw, the fierce, protective light in her eyes that defied the impossible odds they faced. It was a look he recognized. It was the look of a soldier in a last stand. The debate inside him died. It was no longer a choice. He had seen them. He could not unsee them. His fence had been breached. "My cabin's not far," he said, his words clipped and practical. He was already untying the oilskin slicker from the back of his saddle. "You'll freeze out here." He didn't offer comfort, only fact. He draped the heavy slicker over her and the children, creating a small tent against the driving snow. "Can you ride?" She nodded, her teeth chattering. "I can." He helped her onto Ajax, a task made clumsy by the children she refused to release. He settled them in front of her, then took the reins, his gloved hand brushing against her frozen fingers. A strange, unwelcome jolt passed through him at the brief contact. He ignored it. He was a rescuer, not a savior. This was a temporary problem to be solved. He would get them to his cabin, wait out the blizzard, and then they would be on their way. His life would return to its quiet, orderly solitude. He had to believe that. He started walking, leading the horse into the teeth of the storm, the three strangers a heavy, complicated weight on his horse and on his soul. The blizzard howled like a wounded animal, and for the first time in years, Caleb Thorne felt the cold reach all the way to his bones. Alara Hayes felt the warmth before she saw it. It was a low, steady heat that seeped into her frozen limbs, a stark contrast to the biting cold that had become her entire world. She surfaced slowly from a gray fog of exhaustion, her first coherent thought one of confusion. She was not in the wagon. She was not in the snow. She was lying on something soft, a straw-filled mattress by the feel of it, and a heavy wool blanket was tucked up to her chin. A fire crackled nearby, its light flickering against a low, timbered ceiling. Her eyes snapped open, and panic seized her. Lily, they're right here, ma'am." The voice was low and gravelly, the same one she'd heard through the blizzard's roar. She pushed herself up, her head swimming. Her children were nestled together on a pallet of blankets near the hearth, sleeping soundly. Their faces, which had been a terrifying bluish white, were now flushed with healthy color. Someone had taken off their wet outer clothes and wrapped them in dry wool. Relief washed over her so powerfully it left her weak. She turned her head. The man who had saved them stood near the fireplace, his back to her, adding a log to the flames. He was tall, his frame lean but powerful under a simple chambray shirt. His dark hair was a little too long, curling over the collar. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motion. The cabin itself was like him, sparse, practical, and built to withstand a siege. A sturdy table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a cot in the corner where she now lay, and shelves neatly stacked with supplies. Everything was clean and orderly. It was a fortress of solitude. He turned, and she got her first proper look at him. His face was all angles, his jaw firm, his nose straight. It was a handsome face, but a hard one, weathered by sun and wind and something else, something deeper. His eyes were the color of a winter sky just before dawn, a pale, clear gray that seemed to see right through her. They held no welcome, only a kind of weary assessment. "Thank you," she said, her voice still raspy. "You saved our lives." He gave a short, dismissing nod. "You were on my land," as if that were the only explanation required. He ladled something from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. "You need to eat." He handed it to her. It was a thick, savory stew, and the smell of it made her stomach ache with hunger. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was calloused and strong, and he pulled away as if he'd been burned. He retreated to the far side of the room, putting as much space between them as possible. She ate, the hot stew warming her from the inside out. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. As she ate, she watched him. He checked on the children, his large hand resting for a moment on Leo's forehead to check for fever, a gesture so gentle it seemed at odds with his stern demeanor. He then moved to the single window, peering out at the white fury of the storm. He is a fortress, she thought, and we have breached his walls. She knew they were an imposition, a disruption to his carefully curated isolation. She felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by overwhelming gratitude. "I'm Alara Hayes," she said into the quiet. "My son, Leo, and my daughter, Lily." He didn't turn from the window. After a long moment, he answered, "Caleb Thorne." The name suited him. It was as solid and unyielding as the man himself. When she finished the stew, she swung her legs over the side of the cot. Her head still felt light, but her strength was returning. She would not be a helpless burden. She had been taking care of herself and her children for months, and she would not stop now. She stood, a little unsteady, and carried the empty bowl to the small wash basin. "You should rest," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. "I'm grateful for your help, Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone firm but polite. "But I will not be idle. I will earn our keep." A flicker of something, surprise, maybe even reluctant respect, passed through his gray eyes. He seemed to expect helplessness from her, the fragility of a city woman lost in the wild. She had learned long ago that such assumptions could be an advantage. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, then gave another one of his curt nods and turned back to the storm. In the days that followed, the blizzard raged, imprisoning them in the small cabin. A rhythm, unspoken and unnegotiated, began to form. Caleb would rise before dawn, tend to the fire, and head out into the blinding snow to check on his lone cow and split wood, returning coated in white, his face grim. Alara, in turn, took over the cabin's interior. She cooked with the supplies he had, making them stretch with a skill born of recent necessity. She mended a tear in Leo's trousers with a needle and thread from her small sewing kit, the only thing besides her children she had managed to save from the wagon. The cabin, which had been a stark bachelor's domain, softened with their presence. The children's quiet chatter filled the corners that had known only silence. Lily's laughter, a sound like tiny bells, would sometimes break through the gloom, and Alara would see Caleb pause, a strange, complicated look on his face, before resuming his task. He spoke little, his sentences short and to the point. He asked no questions about her past or where she was going, and for that, she was grateful. The truth was a dangerous thing, a story of grief and betrayal that had driven her across a continent. One afternoon, while Caleb was outside, she found a small, worn Bible on a high shelf. Tucked inside was a faded tintype. It was of a young Caleb, his face unlined and smiling, his arm around a young woman with a sweet face. He was wearing a soldier's uniform, a Union uniform. She felt a pang of understanding. The hardness in his eyes was not native to him. It had been forged in the fires of war. She put the photo back, feeling like an intruder. His fences were there for a reason. That evening, after she had put the children to sleep on their pallet, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was not empty, but full of unspoken things. Caleb sat at the table, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound besides the wind. Alara was darning one of Caleb's socks, a task she had taken upon herself. It was a simple domestic act, yet felt strangely intimate. "That uniform," she said quietly, her voice startling them both. "The one in the photograph. You fought in the war." He stopped sharpening the knife. His knuckles were white where he gripped the handle. He didn't look at her. "I did. My husband, Robert, he fought too," she said, the words catching in her throat. "He never came home. Gettysburg." Caleb finally looked up, his gray eyes losing some of their hardness, replaced by a shared shadow. He knew that loss. He didn't have to say it. She could see it in the lines around his mouth. "I was at Gettysburg," he said, his voice low. "It was a place of ghosts. He was a good man," she whispered, mostly to herself. His family. They were not. She hadn't intended to say more, but the unexpected crack in his armor had opened a fissure in her own. After he died, they wanted to take the children. His father is a powerful man in Philadelphia. He believes they are his legacy, his property. He thinks a woman alone cannot raise them properly. I couldn't let him. I sold the last of my jewelry, bought the wagon, and ran. The whole story tumbled out, a torrent of fear and injustice. She told him of her father-in-law, Bartholomew Hayes, a man whose love was a cage of gold. She told him of the threats, the lawyers, the slow, suffocating pressure. He will never stop looking for them. Caleb rose and walked to the window, looking out into the black, swirling night. He was a lone wolf who had inadvertently taken a wounded doe and her fawns into his den. He was beginning to understand that the blizzard was not the only storm he had to face. Another, far more dangerous one, was heading his way, and it had a name, Bartholomew Hayes. Caleb felt the change in the cabin's atmosphere like a shift in barometric pressure. The silence that had once been his comfort was now filled with the soft sounds of a life he had deliberately abandoned. The rustle of blankets as a child turned in sleep, the quiet hum of a woman singing a lullaby, the scent of baking bread mingling with the familiar smell of wood smoke. Alara and her children were a complication he hadn't wanted, a breach in the defenses he had spent years perfecting. Yet he found himself admitting a dangerous truth in the privacy of his own mind. Their presence was not entirely unwelcome. He watched her as she moved about the cabin. She was not the fragile city flower he had first assumed. There was a strength in her, a quiet resilience that he recognized and respected. She worked from dawn until dusk, turning his crude shelter into something that felt perilously close to a home. She never complained. She never asked for anything. She simply did what needed to be done, her hands, though clearly unaccustomed to such labor, proving surprisingly capable. He found himself noticing things. The way a loose strand of dark hair would fall across her cheek as she leaned over the fire. The determined set of her chin when Leo was being stubborn. The soft, unguarded look on her face when she watched her children sleep. These observations were intrusions, unwelcome thoughts that he tried to push away. Feelings were a weakness, a gateway to the kind of pain he had sworn he would never experience again. The war had taken his brother. A fever had taken his betrothed, the woman in the tintype. He had learned his lesson. Love was a synonym for loss. Yet, when he accidentally brushed her hand as he passed her a log for the fire, a current, warm and unnerving, shot up his arm. He saw the startled look in her blue eyes and knew she had felt it too. He retreated immediately, his emotional fences slamming back into place. He became more terse, his answers shorter, his movements more rigid. He spent more time than strictly necessary outdoors, checking fence lines that didn't need checking, the brutal cold a welcome distraction from the warmth spreading through his chest. She was fighting a losing battle, and he knew it. Her story about her father-in-law had settled in his gut like a stone. Bartholomew Hayes. The name sounded rich and ruthless. Caleb had seen men like that in the war, officers who treated their soldiers like chess pieces, devoid of humanity. The thought of such a man laying claim to Leo and Lily, of taking them from their mother, stirred a protective instinct he thought had died on the fields of Virginia. It was an old, familiar feeling, the same one that made him stand with his company against a charging line of cavalry. It was terrifying. When the blizzard finally broke, the world outside was a pristine, blinding expanse of white. The air was sharp and clean. For Alara, it meant hope, the possibility of moving on. For Caleb, it meant the end of their forced proximity, a return to his chosen solitude. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it left a hollow ache in his chest. "I'll need to go to town for supplies," he announced one morning, the words sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. "The trail should be passable now." Alara looked up from where she was helping Lily form a small doll out of scraps of cloth. "We've used so much of your food. I must repay you." "No," he said, the words sharper than he intended. "It was a storm. You helped folks in a storm." He pulled on his heavy coat, avoiding her eyes. "Stay inside. Lock the door behind me." The ride to the small settlement of Promise Creek was slow going, the snow deep in the drifts. The town was beginning to stir back to life after the blizzard. Smoke curled from every chimney, and the sound of shovels scraping against wooden walkways echoed in the cold air. Caleb tied Ajax outside the general store and went inside. The storekeeper, a portly man named Henderson, greeted him with a nod. "Thorn, thought that storm might have buried you for good." "Not yet," Caleb grunted, handing over his list. As Henderson gathered the flour, salt, and coffee, the door creaked open, letting in a swirl of frigid air. Two men entered. They were wildly out of place. They wore expensive city coats and polished boots, their faces clean-shaven and soft, unlike the wind-burned faces of the local men. They moved with an air of arrogance, their eyes scanning the store's occupants with casual disdain. "We're looking for someone," the taller of the two said, his voice carrying an Eastern accent that grated on Caleb's ears. "A woman. traveling with two small children. Dark hair, blue eyes, probably in a state of distress. Caleb's blood ran cold. He kept his back to them, pretending to inspect a display of axe handles, but every muscle in his body was coiled tight. Henderson stroked his beard. Can't say I have. Lots of folks passing through, but with that blizzard, ain't nobody been moving for days. She would have been in a wagon. A Conestoga, the second man added. The wool might have broken. She's taken something that doesn't belong to her. The lie was so blatant, so self-serving, it made Caleb's hand itch for the Colt holstered at his hip. He could feel their eyes on his back. He was a loner, a man who kept to himself, in a small town that made him an object of curiosity, perhaps even suspicion. He paid Henderson for his supplies, his movements deliberate and calm. He did not look at the two men. He walked out of the store, loaded his saddlebags, and mounted Ajax, feeling their gaze follow him down the street. He didn't head straight for home. He took a winding, circuitous route, checking his back trail. It wasn't long before he saw them, two riders, keeping their distance but clearly following him. They had found him. The storm from the east had arrived. He led them on a chase through the thickly wooded hills, using his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. Finally, in a narrow canyon where the snow lay deep, he reined Ajax to a halt and turned to face them. He let his coat fall open, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. They pulled up a dozen yards away, their horses breathing hard. They were city men, but they were not fools. They had guns. "You're a hard man to follow, friend," the tall one said, a false pleasantness in his voice. "Depends on who's following," Caleb replied, his voice flat and cold as ice. "We asked a question back in town," the man continued, his smile fading, "about a woman and two children. We have reason to believe you might know something." Caleb's gray eyes were devoid of all emotion. He looked straight through them, his gaze as empty and vast as the winter landscape. "I told the storekeep. Ain't seen anyone. It's been just me and the snow." The lie was perfect in its simplicity. His reputation as a recluse was now his greatest asset. The two men exchanged a look. They saw a hard, solitary man who wanted nothing to do with the world. It was a plausible story, but the shorter man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of doubt in their depths. "A man could earn a great deal of money for information leading to their return," he said, his voice oily. "Mr. Bartholomew Hayes is a very generous employer." The name hung in the air between them, a declaration of war. Caleb's expression did not change. "I'm not looking for employment." He held their gaze for a long, silent moment. The canyon was utterly still, the only sound the soft sigh of the wind. Finally, the tall man gave a curt nod. "If you do see anything, ask for Mr. Pike at the saloon." They turned their horses and rode away, defeated for the moment. Caleb watched them go, but he felt no relief. This was just the beginning. They would be back. He turned to Ajax and urged him toward home, his mind racing. He was no longer just a rescuer. He was now a protector. He galloped back to the cabin, the image of Alara's fearful face burning in his mind. He had to tell her. They had to make a plan. His quiet, solitary life was over. It had ended the moment he'd chosen to help the woman in the snow. The days leading up to Christmas were heavy with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. The news Caleb brought back from town had settled over the cabin like a shroud. Alara's fear was a palpable thing, a constant, silent presence that shadowed her every move. She startled at every creak of the floorboards, her eyes darting to the window at the sound of the wind. Caleb saw the terror she tried so hard to hide from her children, and it stoked the embers of his own cold fury. Leo and Lily, sensing their mother's distress, were subdued. They understood loss in the way children do, not in its abstract entirety, but in its immediate, tangible form. They had lost their home, their toys, their father. Now, the festive season served only as a stark reminder of all they no longer had. Leo, who was old enough to remember past Christmases, asked his mother one evening, his voice small, if Santa Claus would be able to find them in the big snow. Alara's heart broke. She knelt and hugged him fiercely, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Santa is very clever, my love, she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She had nothing for them. No gifts, no sweets, not even a ribbon for Lily's hair. Her every possession, save for the clothes on their backs and her little sewing kit, was lost in the ruined wagon, buried under feet of snow. Caleb watched this exchange from his corner, the sight of her forced bravery and the children's innocent hope a painful twist in his gut. He remembered Christmases from before the war, the cabin of his youth filled with the scent of pine and his mother's baking, the simple, hand-carved gifts from his father. It was a memory from another lifetime, belonging to a different man. He had not thought of Christmas in years. The day, like all others, was simply a date to be survived. But seeing the sadness in Lily's eyes and the forced cheer in Alara's, something shifted in him. That night, long after the others were asleep, he sat by the dying fire, a block of pine in one hand and his sharpest knife in the other. He worked slowly, methodically, his calloused hands surprisingly deft. The wood shaved away in fragrant curls, and under his patient blade, a shape began to emerge. First, a small, sturdy horse, complete with a flowing mane and tail. Then, from another piece of wood, he carved a simple doll, its form smooth and elegant. He sanded them with a piece of worn leather until they were soft to the touch, the pale wood glowing in the firelight. It was a small, inadequate gesture, but it was something. The next day, he announced he was riding out to check his traps. It was a lie. He rode the long way around to the wreckage of the wagon. It took him hours of digging through the heavy, packed snow, his muscles aching with the effort. But he finally found it, a small, battered trunk. It was frozen shut, but he managed to pry it open with the head of his axe. Inside, amongst ruined dresses and damp books, were a few precious items that had survived. A hairbrush with a silver handle, a small, leather-bound copy of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and tucked in a corner, a small velvet pouch. He didn't look inside. It felt too personal. He gathered these treasures, along with the wooden figures he had carved, and wrapped them all in a spare blanket. He returned to the cabin near dusk. Alara was at the table, showing Leo how to draw letters on a piece of slate. Lily was listlessly playing with her cloth doll. The mood was somber. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment, the wrapped bundle in his arms feeling heavy and awkward. He was a man of action, not sentiment. This was foreign territory. He cleared his throat. "Looks like Santa got a bit lost in the blizzard," he said, his voice gruff to cover his unease. "Came on my traps. Asked me to deliver these." He laid the bundle on the table. The children stared, their eyes wide. Alara looked from the bundle to Caleb, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning wonder. Slowly, she untied the blanket. Leo gasped when he saw the carved horse. He picked it up, his small hands tracing its smooth lines. "A pony," he breathed, his face alight with a joy so pure it was almost painful to watch. Lily's eyes fell on the little wooden doll. She clutched it to her chest, a radiant smile spreading across her face. Then Alara uncovered the book, the silver-backed brush, and the velvet pouch. She opened the pouch, and inside was a simple gold locket, her husband's wedding gift to her. Tears streamed down her face, silent and unchecked. She looked up at Caleb, her blue eyes shimmering. She saw past his hard exterior, past the gruff words and stony expression. She saw the hours of carving, the monumental effort of digging through the snow. She saw the thought, the kindness, the profound, unspoken tenderness of the act. It was the most precious gift she had ever received. That night, after the children were asleep, clutching their new treasures, a new kind of quiet settled in the cabin. It was a quiet of shared understanding. But Caleb knew this moment of peace was a fragile truce, not a victory. Pike and his man were still in Promise Creek. Bartholomew Hayes's reach was long. Kindness and carved toys would not protect this family. He stood by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. "Your father-in-law," he began, his voice low. "These men he sent, they'll be back. And they won't just ask questions next time. They'll have papers. A judge for back east, bought and paid for. They'll say you're an unfit mother, a vagrant. They'll use the law to take the children. He heard her sharp intake of breath. He turned to face her. Her face was pale, her earlier joy extinguished by renewed fear. "There's one way to stop them," he said, the words feeling foreign and momentous on his tongue. "One thing that gives a man legal authority here. Something their Eastern court orders can't easily overturn." He took a breath. "We get married." Alara stared at him, speechless. The idea was absurd, radical, a marriage of convenience. To this stranger, this hard, silent man who had, in the space of a few weeks, become her reluctant guardian. "They can't take children from their mother and their legal stepfather," he continued, laying out the logic like a battle plan. "My name on a piece of paper gives you a shield. This land, this cabin, it becomes their legal home. It makes you a homesteader's wife, not a vagrant. It's a wall they can't break down. Not easily." She searched his face, looking for something beyond the cold practicality. Was this pity, or is it something more? His gaze was steady, his gray eyes intense. He was offering her his name, his protection, the sanctuary of his life. He was offering to stand between her family and the man who would destroy it. "You would do that?" she whispered. "For us? For strangers?" "You're not strangers anymore," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had ever told her. "You're here. That makes you my concern." Alara thought of her children, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. She thought of the wolves her father-in-law had sent. Caleb's proposal was a drastic, desperate measure, but her situation was drastic and desperate. It was a shield, as he said, a fortress, and he was its keeper. She lifted her chin, her resolve hardening. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and strong. "On one condition." He waited, his expression unchanging. "If we do this," she said, meeting his gaze without faltering, "it is not just a piece of paper. It must be a true partnership. We face this threat together. We protect this family, our family, together. No more secrets, no more walls between us." She was not just accepting his offer. She was making a demand of her own. She was asking for more than just his name. She was asking for him. A long moment passed. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the cabin walls. Caleb looked at this woman, at her fierce dignity and unwavering strength. She was meeting his practical solution with an emotional covenant. It was the very thing he had spent years avoiding. But looking at her, he knew he could not refuse. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Together, he agreed. The single word was a vow. The journey to Promise Creek the next morning was fraught with a new kind of tension. It was not the fear of pursuit, but the heavy reality of the pact they had made. Leo and Lily, bundled warmly, rode with Alara on a gentle mare Caleb had borrowed from a neighbor's fallow pasture, while Caleb led the way on Ajax. The children were quiet, sensing the gravity of the day. Promise Creek was quiet, the midweek doldrums having settled over the town. Caleb's first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was a man in his late 50s, with a face like a worn map and eyes that missed nothing. He was gruff, but fair, a man who believed in the spirit of the law more than the letter. Caleb stepped inside, Alara a step behind him. He removed his hat. "Sheriff, we need a favor." Brody looked from Caleb's determined face to Alara's anxious one, his gaze lingering for a moment on the children peering from behind her skirts. He had heard the questions Pike and his partner had been asking around town. He had also seen the kind of men they were. "Circuit Judge is in town," Brody said, his tone noncommittal. "Staying at the boarding house." "What kind of favor?" "We need to get married," Caleb said, the words blunt and unadorned. "Today, and we need a witness." The sheriff's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. He looked at Caleb, the notorious recluse, and the woman who was clearly a newcomer. He connected the dots. The men from the east, the woman with 2 children, the sudden marriage. He didn't need the details. He understood the strategy. "Judge Henderson is a good man," Brody said, his voice lowering. "And he doesn't have much patience for bought and paid for warrants from back east." He stood up, grabbing his hat. "Let's go see the judge." The ceremony was held in the judge's stuffy boarding house room. Judge Henderson was a frail-looking man with a surprisingly booming voice. He looked at Caleb and Alara over the top of his spectacles, his expression kind. Sheriff Brody stood as their witness, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent, solid presence. Leo and Lily huddled by the door, watching with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The judge's words washed over Alara in a blur. Do you, Caleb Thorne, take this woman, Alara Hayes, to be your lawfully wedded wife to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live? Caleb's voice was firm and clear, echoing in the small room. I do. He looked at Alara as he said it, his gray eyes holding hers, and in their depths she saw not just practicality, but a raw, unflinching commitment. And do you, Alara Hayes, take this man? She took a shaky breath, her heart pounding. This was not a love match. It was a treaty, a desperate alliance. But as she looked at the hard, honorable man beside her, who was willing to sacrifice his cherished solitude for her and her children, a different feeling stirred within her. Gratitude, respect, and something warmer, something that felt dangerously like hope. I do, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, the judge declared, I now pronounce you man and wife. He smiled faintly. You may kiss the bride. An awkward, charged silence fell. This was not part of the plan. This was not about legal shields or practical arrangements. This was intimate. This was real. Caleb turned to her. He was closer than he had ever been. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his internal war visible on his face. Then, he gently cupped her elbow, leaned in, and brushed his lips against hers. It was a brief, chaste kiss. It was dry from the cold air, hesitant, and over in an instant. But for Alara, it felt like a brand. It was the sealing of a contract that went far beyond the paper the judge was signing. It was the touch of a man who had just bound his fate to hers. A jolt, sharp and sweet, went through her. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark, his expression unreadable. He had felt it too. They signed the document. Caleb Thorne and Alara Thorne. Her new name felt strange, heavy. It was a shield, but it was also a chain binding them together. As they stepped back out into the cold, bright sunlight, Sheriff Brody tipped his hat. Congratulations, Mrs. Thorne, he said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. You let me know if those city fellas give you any more trouble. The ride back to the ranch was even quieter than the ride in. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were husband and wife. The words echoed in Caleb's mind, a constant, unnerving refrain. He had let her in. He had broken all his own rules. He glanced back at her. She was watching him, her expression thoughtful. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet strength. Their alliance was forged. Now, all they could do was wait for the enemy to test its strength. The next week passed in a state of suspended animation. The marriage certificate, tucked away in a small wooden box, was a silent testament to the new reality of their lives. On the surface, little changed. Caleb still tended to the ranch, his days filled with the hard, physical labor of survival. Alara still managed the cabin, her presence a constant, quiet hum of domesticity. But beneath the routine, everything was different. A new awareness existed between them, a current of unspoken tension and burgeoning feeling. Caleb found his gaze lingering on her more often. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough, her movements efficient and sure. He listened to her read to the children in the evenings, her voice a low, soothing melody that settled something restless in his soul. He had invited her and her children into his home to protect them, but he was beginning to realize he was the one in the most danger. She was methodically dismantling the fences around his heart, not with force, but with simple, quiet grace. He was terrified. He was enthralled. For Alara, Caleb was a study in contrasts. He was the gruff, solitary man who spoke in clipped sentences, yet he was also the man who had carved toys for her children and had noticed the locket in her trunk. He was the fierce protector who had faced down hired guns without flinching, and he was the husband who slept on a pallet on the floor, giving her and the children the only cot, maintaining a respectful distance that was both a comfort and a strange source of disappointment. She saw the wariness in his eyes, the walls he kept firmly in place. Her condition for their marriage, a true partnership, seemed a distant goal. Yet, she felt a growing certainty that behind those walls was a good and honorable man, a man worth knowing. The first crack in his armor came unexpectedly. One evening, Leo, feverish with a cold, began to cough, a dry, racking sound that echoed the terrible coughs Alara had heard in the hospital wards back east. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her. Caleb, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, went still. He watched as she held Leo, trying to soothe him, her own panic rising. Without a word, Caleb stood up and went to a high shelf. He took down a small tin and brought it to her. "Mullein and horehound," he said, his voice low. "My mother used to make a tea with it for lung fever. You mix it with honey." He helped her brew the herbal remedy, his large, steady hands working alongside hers. He held the cup for Leo, coaxing the boy to drink the bitter liquid. He sat with them long into the night, placing cool, damp cloths on the boy's forehead. He said little, but his presence was a solid, calming anchor in her sea of fear. By morning, Leo's fever had broken. Alara looked at Caleb across the sleeping child, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so profound it was painful. He had shared a piece of his past, a memory of his mother, a crack of light in his fortress of solitude. The inevitable confrontation came 3 days later. A cold, clear morning. Caleb was splitting wood when he saw them, 2 riders cresting the ridge that overlooked his valley. Pike and his partner. This time, they were not alone. A third man was with them, a portly, well-dressed man who rode with the entitled slump of someone unaccustomed to a saddle. And behind them, Sheriff Brody. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped the axe and strode toward the cabin. "Alara, inside. Lock the door and stay away from the window." She herded the children into the cabin, her face pale, but her eyes resolute. She knew this was it. Caleb grabbed his rifle from its pegs over the door, his movements economical and deadly. He didn't take cover. He stood in the open, in front of his home, a solitary figure of defiance. The riders pulled up 20 yards away. Sheriff Brody looked uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on Caleb. "Thorne," the sheriff said, his voice strained. "This is Mr. Davies. He's a federal marshal from Helena. He has a warrant." The portly man, Davies, smirked. "A legal warrant, Thorne, signed by a territorial judge. It grants me the authority to take custody of the children, Leo and Lily Hayes, and return them to the care of their legal guardian, their grandfather, Mr. Bartholomew Hayes." Pike and his partner fanned out, their hands hovering near their pistols. Their expressions were triumphant. Caleb's rifle remained pointed at the ground, but his grip was iron. "This is my property, Marshal, and those children are on it." "Not for long," Davy sneered. "Their mother is a vagrant, emotionally unstable, and has absconded with them. The court has deemed her unfit." "The court has been misinformed," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She is not a vagrant. She is my wife." Davies's smirk faltered. Pike's eyes widened in disbelief. Sheriff Brody allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Your wife," Davies sputtered. "That's preposterous. It's a trick. The paper is filed in Promise Creek," Caleb stated. "Witnessed by Sheriff Brody himself. She is Alara Thorne. This is her home, and those children are my stepsons. You have no jurisdiction here, Marshal. Your warrant is for a woman named Hayes and her children who are not on this property." The legal trap was sprung. Davies's face turned a mottled shade of red. He had been outmaneuvered. "This is an obstruction of justice," he blustered. "No," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "This is you trespassing on my land, and I'm telling you to get off it." Pike, seeing his fat paycheck disappearing, lost his composure. "We're not leaving without the brats," he snarled, and his hand went for his gun. It was a fatal mistake. Caleb's rifle came up in a blur. He didn't aim to kill. He aimed for the branch of the pine tree just above Pike's head. He fired. The shot was deafening in the cold, still air. The branch exploded in a shower of bark and snow, which rained down on the hired gun. Pike screamed, throwing himself from his horse, thinking he'd been shot. At the same instant, a second shot rang out, this one from the cabin. The single window shattered, and the other hired gun cried out, clutching his arm as his pistol clattered to the snow. Caleb risked a glance toward the cabin. He saw Alara standing in the frame of the broken window, his old shotgun held steady in her hands, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel. Her face was fierce, her eyes blazing. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a soldier fighting for her family. A wave of fierce, protective pride surged through him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. She was his wife. She was his partner. Sheriff Brody drew his own weapon. "That's enough," he roared. "Davies, your warrant is invalid. Pike, you're under arrest for attempted assault. The rest of you, get off this land before I arrest you for trespassing and anything else I can think of." Davies, sputtering with impotent rage, stared at Caleb, then at the cabin, then at the wounded man moaning in the snow. He was beaten. He gathered his reins, his face a mask of fury. "This isn't over, Thorne," he spat. "Bartholomew Hayes does not lose." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, the now one-armed hired gun following meekly behind. Sheriff Brody disarmed Pike and tied his hands. "I'll take this trash back to town," Brody said, his eyes meeting Caleb's. There was a deep, mutual respect in the look. "The marshal will file a complaint, but it won't stick. You're in the clear, Thorne. You both are." Caleb watched them go, his rifle still held at the ready. The immediate danger had passed. The valley was quiet again. He slowly lowered the rifle, his knuckles white. He turned and looked at the cabin. At his home, Alara stood in the doorway, the shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. Her hair was a mess, her face smudged with soot, and he had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. The battle was over. The war for their future had just begun. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, the adrenaline that had coursed through them drained away, leaving a raw, vibrating silence. The smell of gunpowder hung in the cold air, a stark reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. Caleb walked slowly toward the cabin, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He stopped a few feet from the doorway, his eyes fixed on Alara. She hadn't moved. The heavy shotgun still looked incongruously natural in her arms. The children ran to her, wrapping their arms around her waist, their faces buried in her skirts. She rested a trembling hand on each of their heads, her protective stance unwavering. Her gaze, however, was locked on Caleb. The fierce battle light in her eyes was softening, replaced by a complex mixture of relief, fear, and a question. He finally found his voice, the words rough and coated with the tension of the fight. "You're a good shot." A faint, shaky smile touched her lips. "My father insisted I learn. He said a woman should know how to protect her home." She had never imagined putting that lesson to such a test. He stepped closer, his presence filling the doorway. He reached out, not to her but to the shotgun, his fingers gently closing over the barrel. He carefully took the weapon from her and leaned it against the doorframe. The act was symbolic, a declaration that the fight was over, at least for now. His hand then came up, his thumb brushing against the smudge of soot on her cheek. His touch was hesitant, yet impossibly tender. "The marriage paper," he said, his voice low, "meant only for her. When I proposed, it wasn't just for protection. Not just for you." He swallowed, the confession costing him a piece of his hard-won solitude. "It was for me." Alara's breath hitched. She stared into his gray eyes and saw, for the first time, the complete absence of walls. The fortress was gone, its gates thrown open. All the vulnerability he had fought so hard to conceal was laid bare before her. "Caleb," she whispered, her own feelings rising up, too powerful to contain. "From a moment you brought us in from the storm, I haven't felt truly alone." She reached up, her hand covering his on her cheek. "When the judge declared us man and wife, I felt safer than I have in years. Not because of the law, because of you." The unspoken emotions that had simmered between them for weeks finally broke the surface. He was no longer just a rescuer. and she was no longer his charge. They were partners, bound not just by a legal document or a shared threat, but by a current of deep, magnetic affection that neither of them could deny any longer. He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation. His kiss was not chaste or brief. It was searching, demanding, a release of all the pent-up fear and longing of the past weeks. It was the kiss of a man who had come home after a long and brutal war, and the kiss of a woman who had finally found a safe harbor. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, the children a warm, living presence between them. They were a family, forged in a blizzard, tested by violence, and sealed with a promise. That night, for the first time, Caleb did not sleep on the floor. After the children were soundly asleep, he laid another log on the fire and turned to find Alara watching him, her expression soft in the flickering light. He crossed the small distance between them and sat on the edge of the cot. He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns over her knuckles. "This cabin is too small," he said, the practical words belying the depth of his meaning. "In the spring, I'll add another room. For the children," he paused, "and a proper bedroom. For us." She smiled, a true, radiant smile that lit up her whole face. "I would like that." She thought of the future, a concept that had been terrifyingly blank for so long. Now, it was starting to fill with images. A larger home, the sound of children's laughter echoing in the valley, this man by her side. "Leo loves to learn. Lily too. Perhaps, someday, we could even build a small schoolhouse. For them, and for the other children in the valley." Caleb looked at her, at this incredible woman who had faced down ruin and still dreamed of building things. He had planned a life of quiet emptiness, and she had filled it with the possibility of a future he had never dared to imagine. A wife, a family, a home, a school, a life. "We will," he said, the words a solemn vow. "We'll build it all. Together." 5 years later, the valley was transformed. The small Spartan cabin was now the heart of a much larger, rambling ranch house, a new wing extending from one side, built from the same sturdy timber as the original. The fences Caleb had once used to keep the world out now served to keep his thriving herd of cattle in. The land, once a symbol of his isolation, was now a testament to his prosperity, a legacy for his family. Alara stood on the wide porch, a hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. She was expecting their second child together, a brother or sister for their 3-year-old son, Robert, named for the husband she had loved and the father Caleb had become. Leo, now a lanky boy of 11, was helping Caleb mend a harness near the barn, his movements mimicking Caleb's with a focused intensity. Lily, at 9, sat on the porch steps, engrossed in a book, her dark hair a mirror of her mother's. They were happy. They were safe. They were home. The name Bartholomew Hayes was now just a distant echo, a ghost of a past that had no power here. After the failed abduction, his influence had been met with the unyielding wall of Western justice and Caleb's reputation. He had retreated, a bitter and defeated old man, leaving them to the peace they had fought so hard to win. Caleb finished his task and walked toward the house, his long limbed stride familiar and beloved. He had changed. The hardness in his face had softened, etched now with laugh lines instead of grief. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, steady light. He was still a quiet man, but his silence was no longer born of pain. It was the comfortable quiet of a man at peace with his world. He came up the steps and wrapped his arms around Alara from behind, his hands spreading protectively over her stomach. He pressed a kiss to her temple, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Leo's getting good with that leatherwork," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "He has a good teacher," she replied, leaning back against his solid chest. Her gaze drifted to the far end of the valley. There, on a small, level patch of ground, a foundation of fieldstone had been laid. The beginnings of her schoolhouse. Their schoolhouse, a promise made in the dark of night, now taking shape in the bright sunlight. "It's a good life, Alara," Caleb said quietly, his eyes following her gaze. She turned in his arms to face him, her love for him a warm, constant flame in her heart. She looked at this honorable loner who had sacrificed his solitude for her, and in doing so, had found his own salvation. She had arrived in his life as a refugee from a storm, bringing chaos and complication to his door. But he had seen her, truly seen her, and had chosen not to turn away. He had learned that true strength was not found in isolation, but in the connections you forge, the family you build, the love you are brave enough to accept. "Yes," she whispered, raising a hand to cup his weathered cheek. "It is." He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss full of the shared history and the future stretching out before them. The sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose, and in the peaceful valley, the Thorne family stood together on the porch of the home they had built, their love a fortress far stronger than any fence.